Okay, well, hello and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the third workshop for the fiscal year 2022-23 funding plan for clean transportation incentives. My name is Graciela Garcia, and I'm the lead staff over the funding plan. And I'm joined today by Lisa McCumber, manager over the funding plan, as well as the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, Financing Assistance for Lower Income Consumers Program, and the Electric Bicycle Incentive Program, and our wonderful team who will also be presenting today. Before we get started, I wanted to go over some logistics before today's discussion. To listen to the live Spanish translation audio, please go to your meeting webinar controls at the bottom of your screen and click the interpretation icon and select which language that you would like to hear. To hear the interpreted language only, click Mute Original Audio. I'd like to note that you must join the meeting audio through your computer audio or voice over internet protocol. You cannot listen to language interpretation if you use the dial-in feature. As a part of joining a language channel, you can broadcast back into the main audio channel if you unmute your audio and speak. So I'm going to let the translator explain the instructions.
Thank you so much, Graciela. Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Me llamo Aldo junto con mi compañera Janet. El día de hoy estaremos proporcionando servicios de interpretación y en un momento en la parte inferior de su pantalla usted verá un icono en forma de un mundo. Favor de presionar el mundo y elegir español. Favor de presionar de nuevo ese icono y elegir poner en silencio audio original. Una vez que haga eso, estará escuchando la reunión en su totalidad en español. Si tiene algún problema técnico, por favor escríbalo en el chat o encienda su micrófono y con mucho gusto lo apoyaremos. Sin embargo, si también está utilizando un teléfono inteligente, va a ver esas mismas indicaciones, pero en la parte de arriba, 3 puntitos suspensivos, presiónenlos y también aparecerá español. Elegir el idioma y escuchará la reunión en su totalidad en español. Gracias por estar presente y que tengan una buena reunión. Thank you so much, Graciela. You may continue.
Thank you, Aldo. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. We anticipate a copy of the recording will be made available on the Low Carbon Transportation Investments and Air Quality Improvement Program Meetings and Workshops webpage in no more than 2 weeks. Materials for today's workshop, including the agenda and slides, are available on the same webpage, and a link to these materials will be dropped in the Zoom chat. In addition, if you would like to request a certificate for participation in today's meeting, please send us an email and we can issue those accordingly. In addition, we'll be leveraging Zoom's raised hand feature to facilitate comments and questions. If there are Zoom disruptions for any reason, including malicious intent, we will immediately end today's meeting and send out another notice to reschedule. And lastly, we're unable to allow anonymous meeting participants for security reasons. Please make sure your name is clear on the Zoom platform. If you have called in, we will adjust your phone number and call on you if you raise your hand based on the last 4 digits of your number. For today's workshop, we'll begin with an overview of the proposed funding allocations. We will then move into a discussion on some of our clean transportation equity and light duty projects, followed by a break. After we return from the break, we will provide an update on some of our on-road and off-road heavy-duty vehicle and equipment projects. We will then open the floor for additional comments and questions on today's presentation before moving to next steps. Please note, we will provide time for questions following each section of today's agenda. As a reminder, here's the current schedule for funding plan development. As you can see on this slide, we're more than halfway through the process, and over the course of the next 2 months, staff will continue to meet with stakeholders, including priority communities and community members, and refine recommendations that will be included in the final funding plan. In October, we will release our proposed funding plan, which will be open for public comment, and we will bring the plan to the board for consideration in November. Staff anticipate implementation of projects and policies approved by the board will begin in December. In addition to the formal schedule, we're always happy to meet and encourage you all to meet with staff at any time. As a reminder, once the funding plan is adopted, the work doesn't stop there. Staff will continue implementation work groups all year long as they work to implement the projects we fund through this process. And with that, let's move into the first agenda item. First, for some background, this slide represents the overarching timeline of funding that is appropriated annually to CARB and is ultimately distributed. The first row represents the development phase, beginning in January of each year with the governor's proposed budget in January, followed by the May revise to when the legislature appropriates funding between June and the end of the legislative session, which this year fell on August 31st. In November, the board typically considers and adopts the funding plan and program implementation kicks off. The second row on the slide represents the implementation phase of funds, which takes anywhere from 6 months to 1 year before funding is distributed. There is a public process that accompanies both phases. As I noted on the previous slide, once the funding plan is adopted, we will hold more work groups as we develop new projects or implement changes to old ones. And now for an update on the budget. The Budget Act of 2022 and related budget trailer bills appropriated approximately $2.6 billion for clean transportation incentives. This year's budget builds on last year's multi-agency, multi-year budget for a proposed total of investment of approximately $10 billion through fiscal year 2026-27. This year's appropriations included in the funding plan are comprised of funding from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or GGRF, the General Fund, Proposition 98 General Funds, and the Air Quality Improvement Fund. As you see on the slide, $381 million was appropriated to CARB for clean transportation equity programs established under Senate Bill 1275, and $2.2 billion was appropriated for heavy-duty zero-emission trucks, buses, off-road equipment, and commercial harbor craft. This slide shows the proposed allocations by project category and funding source based on what the legislature has appropriated for fiscal year 2022-23. It is important to note that much of this funding was appropriated in the state budget specifically to several projects within these categories. Staff will present the detailed proposed project-specific allocations and updated proposals later in the presentation. In terms of next steps, CARB will consider feedback heard during today's workshop and continue one-on-one meetings, including following up with stakeholders and community members we have already met with to provide updates on feedback received and how it is being considered. The final funding plan will be available for a 30-day public comment period in October, and staff will present the plan to the board for consideration in November. One additional item we wanted to tee up and get some feedback on today is staff is considering posting attendee names and affiliation following each public meeting on our CARB website. And we recognize there's both pros and cons to this approach, but we wanted to get thoughts from you all on whether or not this is something we should implement. And before we go into our first Q&A session, I'm going to hand it off to Lisa McCumber to say a few remarks.
Thanks, Grace. I just wanted to take a moment to address a few concerns that we've heard about transparency and process associated with implementing the funding plan. As Grace showed on slide 5, I'm not sure if we can slide back there really quick. We have a parallel public process for our funding plan, policy development, and implementation policies. While today's the last workshop for the development of this year's funding plan, it's not the last opportunity to provide feedback and help guide us as we bring these programs and program adjustments to reality. While we've held now 3 workshops on the funding plan and about a dozen or so work groups on the plan as well since March, since January, we've held almost 24 program implementation work groups. Those are all work groups that are done after the board hearing to really implement the projects that the board's approved. They're all listed on our meetings and workshops page. And in response to feedback, we started providing slides at all of those work groups. We're doing our best to post them as quickly as we can, although we recognize sometimes we fall short, like today. Unfortunately, the budget passed so late, and it was a little different than we had anticipated. So we got our slides out as fast as we could, but we know that you haven't had a chance to digest them. And the meeting isn't the end of the conversation. So we are looking forward to hearing from you after you've had a chance to digest what we put out here today. So continue to talk with us. It's a very iterative process and we need your constant feedback. And once the funding plan is adopted, we move into the next phase, which is developing competitive solicitations and having work groups on the next layer of policies that are in these programs. We work really closely with our program administrators to get the nuts and bolts ready for consumers to participate. But we don't do that work behind closed doors. Our program administrators provide a really valuable resource. They're experts in a field that we simply are not. And we select them through a competitive process that's necessary so that we're comfortable that the entity responsible, we're comfortable working with them as the entity that's responsible for issuing the funds for these programs. We look to them to bring us ideas and bring us solutions, but then we bring those ideas and those solutions back to our work groups to get your input to build into our terms and conditions and our implementation manuals so that we can run the best possible programs. A great example of this is what we've been doing this year on the needs-based model for the financing assistance program. The board approved that adoption for that model last year. And this year we've had several work groups that have focused specifically on what does that look like? How are we going to implement it? And what do we need to do? Now we're at a point where we're going to need to bring an administrator on board to help us figure out those nuts and bolts. And then we'll move forward with more work groups to talk about what we're going to implement when we actually get the program open to consumers. So there'll be a lot more conversations on that front. The process has really bloomed from our foundational regulation back in 2008 for the air quality improvement program. But we provide even more opportunities for public feedback than we ever have before. And while there may be some elements of things like within the competitive solicitation, like scoring criteria or the exact scope of work that aren't public in advance, that's because of the competitive nature of the process. And we need to ensure that every applicant has a level playing field when it comes to applying and administering these funds. So I really want to assure you that while this is our last workshop for the year, this isn't the last time we'll be talking with you. We really need you to stay engaged, continue to help guide us. We've got a lot of work to do to implement the dollars for this year. So we're really looking for your feedback. And so stay tuned, continue to partner with us. And Grace, we can go ahead and kick to questions.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. I'm going to hand it off to Aria to open up the lines for questions.
Thank you, Grace. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you joining, to raise your hand, you can use the Zoom feature. For those of you participating by phone, please press pound or #2 to raise your hand. When you're called on, please state your name and affiliation. Just as a reminder, there is no Q&A box, so if you would like to make a comment or have a question, you will need to raise your hand. I'm not seeing any raised hands. So if you guys, oh, I'm sorry, I spoke too soon. Sammy Estrada, I have unmuted your mic. Sammy, you'll need to unmute on your end as well.
Okay, I think I did it correctly. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm old school and I'm trying to come in on my phone here. But I've got a question. So is there for this fiscal year for trucks?
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second. Can you repeat your question?
Yes, my question is there any funding left for new trucks?
So the funding included in this year's funding plan has yet to be considered by the board. So it's yet to be available, but I can kick it to the heavy duty team to give you the status on our current heavy duty project funding status.
Okay, before he jumps in, Kit, or somebody else jumps in, I'm sorry. I was told that there's already been funding. I know several people that said they've already received funds earlier in the year to buy new trucks. Now, is there something I'm missing or I don't understand as far as the funding goes?
So there's a number of heavy duty truck replacement programs that CARB implements. And so funding is typically available year round. However, we get annual appropriations from the legislature. And so that is what is included in our annual process to develop the funding plan to get those funds approved for the current fiscal year.
Okay, and so I guess my situation is, as of January the 1st, I have 3 trucks and I'm not going to be allowed to use them anymore. Will I be able to get some kind of funding before January the 1st?
So
To
possibly.
replace-
So Sammy, what I'd like to do is give you a resource that can be really helpful. There definitely could be some opportunities for you. We have a truck stop website that you can call that can help give you information specific to your fleet and let you know what types of things are available. And then Andrea, I know you just hopped off, but we do have staff that oversee our zero emission bus and truck voucher program. And so she might be able to speak to when we expect or where that is with funding as well. But if you have a pencil ready,
I do.
the phone number to call would be 866-6-DIESEL, DIESEL.
Okay, great.
Okay, and they can absolutely help guide you. And if you have trouble, you're welcome to reach out to Graciela or myself, and our email information is at the end of the slide presentation. And we'll make sure that you get connected with the resources that you need.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thanks for answering my question.
Of course. Andrea, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sure. I was just going to add that our heavy duty truck and bus incentive program, Hvip, does currently have funding available. So if you're interested in purchasing a zero emission truck, highly encourage folks to check out Hvip. You can visit the website, which is californiahvip.org, for more information on the trucks that are eligible for Hvip and information on how to participate.
Okay, what was that website again?
It is California Hvip, HVIP.org. And I can throw that into the meeting chat as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, I got my questions answered. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Sammy. Next up, and just as a note for everybody, please be mindful that the interpreters are trying to listen. So just keep that in mind when speaking or asking questions. But next up, we have Roman. Roman, I have unmuted your mic.
Thanks, Aria. Hey everyone, Roman Partia Lopez with the Green Lining Institute. Thank you, Graciela, for setting the stage here, and thank you, Lisa, for those remarks around transparency and process. I think it's important for us to highlight those components, and I was going to wait to make comments about that till later on, and I definitely don't want to deter the conversation here. So I definitely want to get into the discussion around the funding breakdowns. But since you brought it up, I will comment now. I think for us, and especially for me, I've been talking a lot about the need for additional transparency. And I appreciate what you stated and the fact that there has been multiple, and I'm going to try to slow down because of the interpreter. I understand that there has been multiple opportunities for engagement, and understand that this is not the final opportunity for providing feedback to this funding plan and to the potential policy and to the funding plan, and then regarding policy decisions. Part of the reason why transparency has continued to come up is because we have had these many work groups and workshops, and yet there are some changes that haven't been reflected in that. And one, we want to make sure that those are addressed, right, as part of this process. But that once we get to that, but then also that we get to a point where the stakeholders are comfortable with moving forward with an RFP, and in a way that is reflective of the comments that have been provided. Lisa, you mentioned that you need to bring on a PA to help make these decisions because they're the experts in the space and they can help provide that needed guidance, which I understand. But as far as I know, generally, once a PA is selected, there really aren't any additional work groups that happen on a specific item to come back and present on what a decision was made on policy decision, on the remaining or open-ended policy questions that remained regarding a specific program. So if that's something that CARB is committing to, then that's great because we want to see more of that. And we want to be more involved in the implementation of these programs moving forward. But it is my understanding that that isn't something that is happening now. So if that is something that you are committing to, definitely we want to hear more about. And really build out processes, right, that take that into account, right? Because many times what happens is that we move into implementation, and then, we might hear that through one-on-one conversations, but not through a public process, right? Not through work groups that are hosted like we're having here today. So I just wanted to highlight that and definitely want to continue the conversation because on this issue, because, I'm committed to these programs and want to make sure that, our communities are seeing the benefits from this, and also want to make sure that we do operationalize equity in a way that is reflective of the feedback that's being provided.
Thanks, Ramon. We are absolutely committed to bringing back the conversations, and we have done that. I sat in the room many times with my program administrators where they've brought us an idea, and my response right back to the program administrator is, that is a great idea, but we need to bring that before a work group. And we have done that for all of our programs for as long as I've been working here. So I'm sorry that there's a thought that we aren't doing that, and that our implementation manuals and other things aren't really being built in a way that's transparent, because I've been in all of these meetings for years, and before we put things out, we really are trying to put them on the table and get feedback. So if there are specific examples where we missed the mark on it, I would appreciate to know, I think, what those were, so that we can go back and look and see what did we potentially miss? Did we not see this as a policy issue? And did we see it as in the weeds implementation issue? But we're required by our regulation to make sure that we're doing this work in a public way. And I know that my team in particular takes that very seriously. And we really do try to have all of the conversations public. And the PA is not there to bring us decisions. The PA is there to help identify problems and offer us solutions, and then we will bring those forward. And again, for those that have worked on CVRP in particular in the years, you've sat in a work group with me where I've said, how do we deal with this issue? Here's the things on the table, and what are we going to do? And we'll keep doing that. So I do absolutely commit to you to continue to do that and to do it more. I think, again, this year we've held way more implementation work groups than we have in the past. And we will continue to do that. So yeah, I hope that helps. We are definitely trying to be as transparent as possible here.
Great. I appreciate that. And yeah, I'll make sure to identify examples for you. And like I said, I think I definitely want to make sure that we move on to the discussion, but just to give a quick one related to this presentation here. In the May presentation, there was a lot of discussion around outreach and education, and there really isn't anything that is listed here on outreach and education. So hopefully we get to that in the discussion, but and then, so anyways, there's others that I can highlight, but definitely don't want to deter this discussion on this issue. And maybe this is a work group that we need to have, thinking about what we need and how to improve transparency and improve and provide procedural equity to the processes that you all have. So thank you.
Right. Thanks, Ramon.
Thank you. So we have time for one last raised hand, and that is Nate Capra. Nate, I have unmuted your mic.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, thank you for having us. Nate Capra, Balboa Island Ferry. question is a short run ferry operator. Hopefully this can be addressed this evening. You know, one of our main funding options as we look at a looming deadline is, you know, the Moyer grant and grants that, you know, incentivize emission reduction below the required level. But, you know, us short run ferries, we are now in a mandated state where we are required to have zero emissions. And it's just, you can, I don't know how we could reduce below zero, but that seems to limit us severely, again, as a deadline is looming, and we're hoping that there are some solutions that we don't know about because we're very concerned.
Thanks for your question and comment, Nate. And we do have funding as a part of this year's funding plan for commercial harbor craft that are affected by the CARB harbor craft regulation, and we're going to be discussing that a little bit more in detail later on in the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and start our light duty session. I'd like to introduce Raquel Leon, who's the lead over the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, to present an update on our light duty vehicle and mobility projects. Raquel.
Thank you, Grace. As Grace mentioned, my name is Raquel Leon, and I'm the staff lead over CVRP. Today, I'm going to cover some updated funding allocations and updated staff proposals for our clean transportation equity and light duty projects. This year's budget and associated budget trailer bills includes $321 million for vehicle purchase incentive investments. This includes at least $125 million to establish Clean Cars for All statewide, at least $80 million for the district-run Clean Cars for All programs, and at least $10 million to fund the Zero Emission Assurance Project. Staff proposes to use the remaining funding to provide additional support for the local air districts for implementation of Clean Cars for All and fund financing assistance and electric bike incentives. Finally, staff proposes to use a small portion of the total allocation to fund equity vehicle purchase incentive outreach efforts through Access Clean California and to provide support for the California State Transportation Agency and its partners Caltrans on the California Integrated Travel Project, or CAL-ITP. This table outlines the proposed allocations for each vehicle purchase incentive program. As a reminder, only 75% of the $126 million of GGRF funding can be spent initially, with the remaining 25%, or $31.5 million, available after the fourth cap and trade auction of the fiscal year and after direction from the Department of Finance. Staff has adjusted the proposal for CVRP based on stakeholder feedback and analysis of California's electric vehicle market and legislative direction in the 2022-23 budget. The proposed recommendations include removing plug-in hybrid electric vehicles from program eligibility by January 1st, 2025, based on legislative direction in this year's budget. Deferring implementation of the second income cap decrease and rebate amount decreases that were originally planned for February of next year. Increasing incentive amounts for low and moderate income increased rebates by $3,000. Aligning increased rebate incentive amounts for battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicles to align with policy and Clean Cars for All and financing assistance. Including a $2,000 prepaid charge card with every increased rebate issued. This is up from $1,000, as we had discussed previously, based on updated analysis that takes stakeholder feedback from last week's work group into account. And lastly, expanding prequalification statewide for lower income car buyers, bringing CVRP increased rebates to the point of purchase statewide. As mentioned in the previous slide, staff is proposing an increase to CVRP increased rebate amounts. Staff recognize a need for an increase in incentive amounts across all vehicle purchase incentive programs, as the current electric vehicle incentive package is not enough to help lower income car buyers get into cleaner cars. And while we've seen record participation in our programs, it has been harder for approved applicants to find an EV that fits into their budget given our current incentive package. CBRP provides increased rebates for applicants with incomes at or below 400% of the federal poverty level. For example, a family of 2 with a combined household income of just over $73,000, or for a family of 4, a combined household income of $111,000 would qualify for the increased rebate. Staff is proposing a $3,000 increase to CBRP increased rebate amounts, bringing rebate totals for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles to $6,500 and bringing rebate totals for battery electric vehicles to a total of $7,500. Staff is also proposing a modest increase for increased rebates for fuel cell electric vehicles to align with battery electric vehicles at $7,500, as incentives for these vehicle types are also aligned in our other vehicle purchase incentive programs. The fiscal year 2022-23 allocation for Clean Cars for All comes from 2 different funding sources, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the General Fund. Per legislative direction, staff proposes a $125 million allocation for the statewide program and $80 million to the district programs from the General Fund. Staff is also proposing to allocate $40 million of GGRF funds to the district programs for a total district program allocation of $120 million. This record investment in the district programs will enable the districts to expand their programs to all low-income residents of their respective jurisdictions. The draft district allocations are $41 million to South Coast AQMD, $29 million to San Joaquin Valley APCD, $26 million to Bay Area AQMD, and $12 million each to Sacramento Metropolitan AQMD and San Diego APC. The district allocations are determined using methodology that I will discuss in detail on the next slide. The guiding principle for the Air District allocation methodology are intended to ensure consistent, predictable funding and use of data-based metrics to determine program demand and future growth. The formula accounts for current and future market conditions, and including the work group meeting held last week, staff have been soliciting public input on appropriate metrics and methodology. As a baseline allocation, each district is given 10% or $12 million of the total allocation. Next, the three districts that have achieved 1,000 projects in a 12-month period are given another 10% of the total allocation. The remaining 20% or $24 million is split amongst those same 3 districts based on their average share of the following populations: total population, population of individuals below 200% of the federal poverty level, disadvantaged community population, and vehicle population from model year 1990 to 2007. Statistics for eligible population, disadvantaged community population, and poverty populations are all calculated using zip code and census tract data from CalEnviroscreen 4.0. Vehicle populations are estimated using DMV data. The draft allocations represent a record investment in every district's Clean Cars for All program. The formula may be adjusted according to public feedback as well as to accommodate legislative direction in future years. However, the guiding principles will remain consistent. Please note that the final numbers may be adjusted by 1 to 2% of the total allocation, or up to $1 to $2 million as we continue to analyze our data, and the funding plan will contain our final. This slide illustrates staff's proposal for Clean Cars for All. In addition to reducing the income limit to 300% of the federal poverty level, staff is proposing to collapse income tiers into 1, 300% of the federal poverty level and below. This translates to a max household income of about $55,000 for a family of 2 and about $83,000 for a family of 4. Staff is also proposing modest increases to incentive amounts by offering $9,500 for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and $10,000 each for battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicles. Staff is also proposing to include a $2,000 adder for applicants living in disadvantaged communities in an effort to direct more dollars to the communities that need it most. In addition to increases in incentive amounts, staff is also considering directing existing district-run Clean Cars for All programs to provide incentives for their entire territory and not just limit their programs to the disadvantaged communities in their territories. Lastly, staff is also considering setting income limits at or below 300% of the federal poverty level for both the statewide and district-run programs. Staff believes that both of these changes allow for easier implementation of Clean Cars for All at the statewide and air district level and reduces confusion for participants. Similar to Clean Cars for All, staff is proposing a reduction in the income limit to 300% of the federal poverty level and collapsing income tiers into one, 300% of the federal poverty level and below, for financing assistance. Staff is also proposing increases in incentive amounts for battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicles, bringing totals to $7,000 for plug-in hybrid, $7,500 for battery electric and fuel cell vehicles. Lastly, staff is proposing to increase incentive amounts for prepaid charge cards offered through financing assistance from $1,000 to $2,000 in an effort to align the amounts offered in Clean Cars for All and those proposed in CBRP. Based on staff's analysis, this amount would cover the first year of charging at public charging stations for eligible participants. Taking these proposals into account, we wanted to spend a little time to go over how they impact the total stacked incentive amounts that an eligible car buyer may get when utilizing multiple car vehicle purchase incentive programs. Currently, eligible car buyers can get $8,000 to $12,000 towards a new EV without scrapping an old vehicle, and $9,000 to $16,500 towards a new EV when scrapping an old vehicle. With staff's proposed increases to incentives, eligible car buyers with incomes at or below 300% of the federal poverty level would now be able to get $13,500 to $15,000 towards a new EV without scrapping an old vehicle, and between $16,000 and $19,500 towards a new EV when scrapping an old vehicle. In addition to these stacked incentive totals, eligible applicants can receive charging incentives and also choose to go through the financing assistance program to obtain low interest rate loans for the purchase of their vehicle. With the proposal to expand CBRP Rebate Now statewide, this provides the opportunity to apply all stacked incentives at the point of purchase. To put this into perspective, the average price of a new EV today ranges from 40 grand to 50 grand, and the stacked incentive amount could help cover about a third to a half of a vehicle's cost. The Zero Emission Assurance Project, or ZAP, was established by Assembly Bill 193 to help lower-income Californians reduce the risk of buying a used ZEV by providing a rebate or vehicle service contract for the replacement battery or fuel cell component. According to the SB 350 guidance document, one of the biggest barriers to ZEV adoption in the marketplace is affordability. If ZEV components fail, replacement batteries in electric vehicles can cost over $5,000. And for many lower income consumers, this type of expenditure makes it unattractive or even impossible to purchase a ZEV. While legislation established this program in 2019, direct funding for ZAP has not been allocated by the legislature through previous annual budget acts. In the interim, funding from the local financing assistance program, the Driving Clean Assistance Program, has been utilized to run a smaller data collection pilot to help inform the future development of ZAP. The grantee that oversees the Driving Clean Assistance Program, the Community Housing Development Corporation, or CHDC, has subcontracted with the Foundation for California Community Colleges, or FCCC, to collect data to better understand how battery life depreciates over time. To collect data for this project, FCCC is installing onboard diagnostics trackers in eligible vehicles on a voluntary basis. The 18-month data collection pilot began in April of this year, and to date, CHDC and FCCC have installed 20 of the planned 45 onboard diagnostics trackers in vehicles purchased through both financing assistance programs. As outlined in this year's budget, staff is proposing an allocation of $10 million, which would be administered through a third-party administrator or other appropriate mechanism to develop and implement a statewide version of ZAP. Staff will work with stakeholders through the public process to determine the policy for the program and next steps. Staff will provide updates on the development and implementation of statewide ZAP in next year's funding plan. Staff's proposed allocation for clean mobility investments is $55 million. This is significantly less than previous work groups, which were based on the governor's proposed budget of $419 million over 4 years. Staff is not proposing policy or programmatic changes based on the budget. All 4 project categories and their specific goals are important to communities. Thus, we are proposing close to equal splits, which were supported in previous work groups. $5 million for planning and capacity building would support dedicated technical assistance for communities to apply for and implement mobility programs, funding for community-driven planning and capacity building, and outreach. $20 million for the CMO Voucher pilot program would support existing projects from application window 1 and increase the voucher cap for window 2, which has technical assistance currently available. $15 million for clean mobility in schools and $15 million for the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project would support an estimated 1 to 3 projects in each category. So now we're going to open it up for some questions and comments based on this material that I just presented. So I'll hand it over to Aria.
Thank you, Raquel. Good afternoon, everyone. You can use the Zoom feature to raise your hand. For those of you participating by phone, please press pound or #2 to raise your hand. When you're called on, please state your name and affiliation. And just as a heads up to everyone who's waiting with raised hands, there are quite a few raised hands already. First up, we have LaDonna Williams. LaDonna, I've unmuted your mic.
Yes, good good hot afternoon, or is it evening? Sorry, LaDonna Williams, All Positives Possible. I had a question concerning the mention of CalEnviroScreen 4.0, which is where you were getting your information from, I guess, determining, I guess, the disadvantaged communities and the info. Our major concern with the new version, I guess this 4.0, is that we've identified that historically disadvantaged, long-term exposed, high-risk communities are missing off of the maps and the information. And these, ironically, are communities that have scored in the previous 3.0, and I guess 2.0 or 3.0 for sure, in the 95 to 99 percentile. I think even a couple of them were 100 when it came to the pollution sources and the higher levels of disadvantaged, overburdened areas. The fact that they are missing now really concerns us, and that how are you, or have you considered the fact that many of these communities have been removed, and how will you adjust or make sure that these communities do not fall through the gaps?
Thank you, LaDonna. I'll handle that, since I think you're referring to the Clean Cars for All allocation formula. So in the way I understand it with 4.0 is that they grandfathered in almost all of the disadvantaged communities under the previous CalEnviroScreen. Now, I'm happy to double check that with the folks here who at CARB who specialize in CES interpretations and making policy based upon that. So I'm happy to double check with them. I will say though, the disadvantaged community population in each district is one factor we use to determine that last 20% of the allocation. So it is disadvantaged community, total population, and vehicle population, and low income population. And low income population is calculated with and when I say low income, they call it poverty population under 200% of the federal poverty level. So all of those are factors, disadvantaged communities just being one of them. So while I'm happy to check on those disadvantaged community statistics, they don't have a giant impact just on themselves. Even if there was another 20 or 30,000 folks in the Bay Area that we think should be counted as disadvantaged, that's not going to affect Bay Area's allocation very much at all. But I'm happy to look into it.
Okay, thank you.
Next up, we have Eileen Tutt. Eileen, I have unmuted your mic.
Hi, thank you. This is Eileen Tutt. I'm representing the California Electric Transportation Coalition. The only thing I would say is, and you've heard this from us before, is we actually believe that CVRP should include more middle income Californians. So although we completely support the modifications you've made to increase the rebates for low income Californians, we continue to be concerned by the exclusion of so many Californians in the middle class. And right now, of course, with the economic situation and the increases in price for electric vehicles, this program could make a big difference for a middle class family considering an EV versus an ICE. And so we would like to see those income caps go, although we totally support income caps, we'd like them to be back where they were pre-February 2022. And and since we are not, there is no constraint on the amount of money, there is sufficient money to allocate to those middle class folks and also increase benefits for low income Californians at a time when pretty much everyone's in the middle class and low income is being constrained. So we would like to see that. I know that we have not really addressed that previously, that is not being, it has been rejected, but we're again saying it is really important because there are so many Californians, and I work with them, who have not been able to get the vehicles because they can't buy a vehicle unless they're willing to offer over MSRP, and they just cannot afford that without some kind of incentive. So I'm just encouraging you to please reconsider going back to the income caps that were reduced in February of this year. And then also one of the things that I wanted to ask about is, I do want to just say, I really want to give the staff a whole lot of credit because you said you wanted to publish the names of people who comment at these workshops or to participate. I have no problem with that, but I will say this, staff has been incredibly transparent and really helpful. Whenever we've asked for a name, they've always connected us with, so I feel like I don't see that as anything. I think you guys have done a fabulous job. I don't care one way or the other if you publish the names, but for anybody who's wondering, if you need to get in touch with anybody on any of these calls, staff has been extremely helpful in helping connect people in these workshops. And I, for one, am I really am thankful for that. The other thing I just want to say on Clean Cars for All, and this is a question for you all, really appreciate the changes you're making there too, especially the statewide. But one of the things that is concerning us, and I know it's a continual challenge and we'd like to work with you on, is this issue of tax liability for low-income folks. So there are some districts that send out, tax liability forms for people who get, and that what that means is these low-income people get this incentive that is now even bigger, and then they have to pay taxes on that income when they're already, basically the only thing that does is make this car affordable for them. But if they have to pay taxes on it, then all of a sudden there's this tax liability that they were not expecting. So we are very concerned about that. Same thing with the fuel card. This is the biggest, and I mean by huge margins, the biggest concern for a low income, and really all Californians in middle income and low income in purchasing an EV, is the upfront cost. That is the number one. 90+% of the people say that is their biggest concern. I've never heard anyone say the cost of electricity is a concern. I mean, literally no one, 0%. We've interviewed and collected data on thousands and thousands of people. So my sense is that if you're going to, if you want to give more money to low income folks, it should be to reduce the upfront cost. And if there's a worry about the cost of fuel for these low income folks, when electricity is actually significantly cheaper, and that's why the total cost of ownership is a problem, then that is an issue that needs to be addressed holistically. You can't just give someone a card. We got to fix the problem of, we have low income people who are paying more for electricity than people in wealthier neighborhoods. That cannot be fixed by giving people $1,000 or a $2,000 card, and shouldn't be addressed that way. So we're just saying, please use CVRP and the vehicle incentives to reduce the upfront vehicle cost, which is the #1 concern, and don't use money to pay for fuel, which then if there's a problem with the fuel cost, then that needs to be addressed in a much more holistic way and not just a one-time fix, which will just come back to bite the new vehicle owner if it's a challenge. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Eileen.
Next up, we have Alex Clifford. Alex, I have unmuted your mic.
Hi, this is actually Eric Williams sitting in for Alice Clifford with San Joaquin RTD. Just a few questions. In an earlier slide, you mentioned about 2 funding sources. What were those 2 funding sources? I didn't catch the funding sources name. And then the second question I have is that there's a term in one of your slides also of scrapping. Can you explain what scrapping specifically means? Thank you.
So the 2 funding sources that we mentioned, the first being the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund,
Okay.
and the second being the General Fund. And that's where our funding is coming from for these programs. And when we're talking about scrapping a vehicle, that means somebody is turning in an old vehicle to have it destroyed, or to get rid of it and get it off the road. And in turn, they get an incentive to purchase a cleaner vehicle.
That's why I thought you meant. Is there a minimum or maximum amount of years that vehicle has to fall into in order to meet that criteria?
I'm going to turn it over to Anthony to respond specifically to Clean Cars for All. I know there's a general age, but I know some of the air districts may set some different criteria.
I'm having a little bit of internet issues. Can you repeat that last part of the question? The age of the.
Right. So in order for an individual to scrap their vehicle in this program, what is the criteria that vehicle has to meet in order to be able to be scrapped?
Thank you for repeating that. I appreciate it. I thought that's what you said, but I wanted to be sure. So it does vary between air districts. I think some air districts allow up to a 2010 vehicle to be scrapped, while other ones are closer to a 20-year-old vehicle, so right around the year 2000 or so.
Okay.
So if you have a specific air district in question, and you can shoot me an email, or I'm happy to help fill you in.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Appreciate it. And just one last thing. The gentleman that asked earlier, you guys mentioned about the HBIP program. RTD has taken advantage of the HBIP program, but just for clarification, that is a program that offers an incentive, a discount towards the purchase of a vehicle. It doesn't pay for the whole vehicle, but it offers a discount towards selected vehicles, and there's approved vendors on that site. So that has been a wonderful program for RTD. Just wanted to share that with the partners.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Cesar Hernandez. Cesar, I've unmuted your mic.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hi. This is Cesar Hernandez, a program manager for CMO at Calstart, part of the administrator team for the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program. Before I go in about some of the concerns and issues we may have around the budget, I wanted to highlight some of the great work that we've been doing, because I feel like there needs to be a story behind why we're doing this work. The Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program has launched 3 mobility project voucher projects throughout California, with 4 additional projects being deployed in the next few months. I'd like to highlight a couple of the projects that we have here, just to kind of give you a sense of like what the work that we're doing. But Chula Vista Community Shuttle, which includes 1 shuttle EV van and 5 other electric sedans, are now available to take seniors anywhere within their community as part of the new shuttle program. Chula Vista suffers from a lack of parking near the Norman Park Senior Center, at many medical offices in the historic downtown and throughout northwest Chula Vista. Seniors have grown increasingly dependent on expensive door-to-door transportation or on the kindness of their neighbors to help them get places to meet their basic needs. Chula Vista Community Shuttle has made a significant impact as a free and clean alternative. The other project I'd like to highlight is the City of Richmond Moves, the innovative transit ride-on-demand services. During the first 2 months of operation, around 450 rides were taken by community members to connect to transit, access health services, education, and other essential services. The local residents of Richmond are disproportionately affected by a variety of health and economic burdens. While the City of Richmond has a robust set of regional multimodal options, there are limited effective first mile, last mile connections. This project helps to improve access to disadvantaged communities who need more affordable and accessible transportation options. That being said, you know, we do want to raise some concerns that we've seen just based off of some of the information we received from Window 1 recipients, but also from our TA outreach. The costs have increased substantially compared to when Window 1 opened. As we all have been experiencing, inflation is playing a major role in operations, staffing, cost of ZEV vehicles, and the added pressure of supply and chain demand has added a significant blow to current mobility project vouchers amount of $1 million. Unfortunately, grantees have had to cut back on their projects. As I mentioned earlier, Chula Vista provides shuttle services for seniors from Monday through Friday. Since launching services, they have been experiencing a high demand. As we all know, seniors don't just travel Monday through Friday. Project had initially planned for Monday through Sunday, but due to limited budget, they had to reduce hours of operations. And they are currently seeking additional funding to expand operating those hours. Some projects had to reduce vehicles, eliminate modes of transportation, and scale back vehicles entirely due to high cost of insurance. This has reduced the services available to and benefits for the community members. With 24 needs assessments completed by Window 1, awardees, and many others already engaged in the Window 2 TA, we are seeing a flurry of interest in all over California in applying to both the CTNA and MPV applications for Window 2. We have been hearing many concerns about funding not being enough in Window 2 and fear they will be running into the same issues as Window 1 grantees. So in addition to CMO, we cannot overstate the value of other mobility equity programs, including the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project, STEP, and Clean Mobility in Schools, CMS. This is a robust suite of programs that provides communities with the resources needed to increase transportation equity and improve air quality with solutions that meet their needs. We support funding for these programs as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Brett Zooner. Brett, I've unmuted your mic.
Hello, thanks for holding this today. And I think probably a lot of people appreciate having it later. So I thought that was cool to see because I'm sure there's people chiming in after work. I wanted to, and I'm Brett Zooner with the Foundation for California Community Colleges. And I manage our team who administers the South Coast, the Replace to Ride program that South Coast Air Quality Management District is funding down here through y'all, as well as the ZAP project, which you mentioned. And I just want to say we're really excited to see momentum on that for the battery funding. That's something that comes up a lot when we're talking to folks, especially people who are interested in a used vehicle. And people in the outreach that we've done for the battery data collection and then as well as just talking to others, yeah, people are very concerned about the range of already kind of shorter range used cars, which you're all aware of. So great to see that there's that initial funding there. Really excited to see what comes out of that. And then the other piece that I wanted to mention, which has kind of been brought up with the 1099s around Clean Cars for All. I was glad to hear that brought up already. That's definitely been an issue for us as one of the case management providers of one of the regional Clean Cars for All programs. And I can see doing the higher incentives, which is totally necessary. Really glad to see that. But there is that flip side, and we're one of the districts that is issuing 1099s, and that's something that y'all are aware of. So I don't need to belabor the point there. But yeah, just thinking through how can we do that, and I'm hopeful that maybe, I don't know how much coordination you're having with the federal government right now, but I'm hopeful that if they are pushing out their own kind of incentives and these points of sale, I'm assuming they're going to do tax law that kind of resembled what Obama did in the early 2010s around the cash for clunkers and gave that IRS exemption. So just highlighting that, hopefully, I hope the state is, engaging with the White House and others at the Fed level to hopefully finally coordinate our incentives and get around the tax issues, because we do need a top-down solution there. So just reiterate. Lastly, in terms of the incentives for the Clean Cars for All, I noticed, I think if my math was right, it's a $2,500 difference for folks not in a DAC and a $4,500 difference for folks in DACs between financing assistance and scrap and replace. And I'm just thinking about, the incentivization there, if you had an old car, especially with the market now, I mean, even like a old Hvip car could get at least 2,500 right now. So I'm wondering, like, are we going to see people opt for financing assistance, which is fine, but there's less money there, and then like not scrap their car because they could get more money scrapping it on the market. So I just wanted to highlight that consideration and just to think about it. And sorry, finally, last thing, the 1099 issue for charge cards. I thought it was interesting that that was brought up, but I wanted to just make a note that, again, us learning from other programs and at the state and federal level, I know that SNAP is not taxed, and that's because it's actually considered payment directly to the government. So it's not considered paying the person. The person just has a card, essentially like if you used a parent's credit card or something, they're not paying you, they're paying whoever owns that money on the card side. And I think if CARB was really intentional about setting that system up at a top-down level, you could maybe frame that as those charging companies are issuing payment to the state of California through those cards. So those people should not be taxed. Just highlighting some things about, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but overall, I'm really pleased with what we're seeing. So happy to see how this all plays out. So thank you.
Thank you, Brett.
Next up, we have Chris Chavez. Chris, I've unmuted your mic.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate this information. As Chris Chavez with Coalition for Clean Air. Just really quickly, first of all, want to thank CARB for taking the consideration, the comments from Charge Ahead, the Charge Ahead campaign regarding the CBRP program. Our position has been to maintain the current income limits, and really making sure and directing the benefits as much as possible into low-income and disadvantaged communities. However, given the current status of the program, we are open, or would urge CARB to consider looking at the needs of the program and whether or not the second half of the changes are needed. But at least at the current level, certainly would want to see those maintained. On Clean Cars for All, which we know has been the majority of our engagement on, we do feel that I think that we have a much stronger level of comfort with the changes that have been proposed. While it's unfortunate to see the direct tie or the complete tie to disadvantaged communities not being included, having that extra bump up for residents of disadvantaged census tracts is certainly certainly helps considerably, and I think gives us a greater degree of comfort. Regarding the also along Clean Cars for All, we want to make sure to also recognize, we appreciate the clarification on the role of the existing programs in the Air District grant programs and how those would interact under statewide expansion. I think that's very helpful, and certainly the direction that CARB has gone is we think a very positive direction on that. Regarding the 1099 issues that others have brought up, certainly we want to echo those concerns. That's something that Charge Ahead has been very concerned about for the past 2 or 3 years now, and we will continue advocating on that. We understand there's some of the complexities of on the federal side, but really, I don't think anybody who applies for this program is expecting, or needs, we don't want to see them get a surprise tax bill, tax liability, because of their participation in a program, because they're just, in a disadvantaged community or they're, income qualified. So it certainly is something that needs to be prioritized. Also, I know that, in terms of comments on the administrator, I want to echo the Ramon's comments earlier about making sure that as many of the details as possible about community engagement and really tailoring the process to community needs are ironed out before we get to the administrator. We know that there are technical details and there are issues that do need to be resolved by the administrator, but we want to make sure that the needs-based assessment is done, is developed in a public way. And then it's also done in a way that, again, addresses the needs of the communities that they're intended to serve. One question I did have, and certainly appreciate some clarification. My understanding is that the increased rebate amounts are supposed to go into effect as soon as the funding plan is for the increased Clean Cars for All amounts is supposed to go into effect as soon as the funding plan is passed. However, I know that many of the air districts that are currently running the program will still be operating under their own grant, or the old grant agreement. So how does CARB plan on addressing any potential shortfalls, any sort of situations where we have districts running out of money for the program and we end up back in a situation where we have wait lists, which is, I think, a fate all of us want to avoid as much as possible. So if you could get some clarification on that, that would be appreciated.
Thanks, Chris. So you are correct that the districts, as long as they're operating under their old grants, will be, and until they get their next year, the fiscal year 22-23 funds approved at the board hearing in November, they will be limited to the existing incentive amounts and not the new ones. We are hoping that once they get those new grants, there's going to be a lot of flexibility there, and that we're going to work with the districts on implementation, because it kind of depends for each district how many people they have in the queue, and we want to work with them and take their input on when they increase the amounts and for whom in the queue when they have that line of demarcation on who's eligible for the higher amounts and who gets funded under the old. So we'll be working very closely with all the districts on that transition.
Got it. It certainly would strongly encourage CARB to figure out how to avoid that situation where you have funding shortfalls, or and again, I think the worst case scenario would be programs being waitlisted again.
Yeah, we agree. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't occur.
And Chris, we'll also be working really closely to make sure that it's aligned across the programs so that we're triggering things as consistently as possible too. So we're working with the administrators to make sure we've got timelines identified and the other programs. So when everything launches, it can launch together.
Understood. Well, again, thanks again for the work on this. And again, I think we've made some really positive progress over the past couple of months, and appreciate CARB responding to the concerns that we highlighted.
Thank you. Next up, we have Stacy. Stacy, I've unmuted your mic.
Thank you. Stacy Renexis with Power Tree Services. We focus on providing charging and energy services in multifamily residential properties. And perhaps I'm jumping the gun, but I didn't hear anything in the discussion about the charging side infrastructure support for low income and moderate income residents who are more likely than not to be living in multifamily properties. We have a dramatic underrepresentation in new vehicle and EV vehicle purchases by residents of multifamily. And the number one issue that we've encountered is the lack of access to charging infrastructure. In our customer surveys of thousands of tenants across multiple districts, we find that 63% of the residents would consider an electric vehicle on their next purchase if they had access to that charging infrastructure at or near their primary residence. And by near, that's within a 1 block walk. I would encourage in any of the planning to ensure that there are incentives focused on multifamily property owners to assure that they actually install chargers and make those available to their residents and to the neighbors of those residents by assuring that those chargers are shared, not just dedicated to each individual resident. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Stacy. We work really closely with the Energy Commission. So the California Energy Commission received a significant amount of funding in this year's budget for charging installations throughout the state. And they do have a program for supporting multifamily dwellings. And I believe that they'll be having some work groups and things on their incentive programs pretty soon. So feel free to reach out to us and we can connect you with that information. And again, we work really closely with them. We are actually trying to coordinate to where we have representatives at each other's workshops. We weren't able to make that happen tonight. But we do work really closely with them and identifying areas where we do see gaps. So thank you very much for pointing that out.
Next up, we have Brian Dodds. Brian, I've unmuted your mic.
Hello, this is Brian Dodds from the Valley Air District. As one of the program administrators for Clean Cars for All, we appreciate CARB's engagement on this process and willingness to take feedback from stakeholders and make updates along the way. And this current proposal, I think, reflects a great deal of work from CARB, and we appreciate that. We look forward to the further expansion of our program within our district with additional funding and additional program allowances from CARB, and we also look forward to further working with CARB on program implementation updates. One comment in particular that I wanted to highlight that may be of concern, we appreciate the increased incentive levels that are outlined in the proposal, but one unintended consequence of that may impact participation. As word gets out about increased incentive levels, it may kind of prohibit some people from moving forward in the interim. So I'd encourage CARB to look for ways to, following board approval of these changes, quickly implement those increased incentive levels as quickly as possible. And that'll do it for my comments. And again, appreciate the time and CARB's work on this.
Thank you. Next up, we have Roman. Roman, I've unmuted your mic.
Yeah, thank you, Aria. This is Roman Partia Lopez with the Green Lining Institute. First off, I want to acknowledge staff for all their hard work in putting this together. I know it's not easy dealing with stakeholders and all the feedback that y'all get. Just want to appreciate y'all for that. First off, there's a couple comments I have and then a question, but just building off of what Brian Dodds from the San Joaquin Valley Air District mentioned right now around expediting this process, Green Lining as well as the Charger Head Coalition is supportive of the increased incentive amounts as presented for the Clean Cars for All program. And, asking CARB to try to expedite that process, right? I think waiting until after the approval process, after the funding approval process to start kind of updating contracts and stuff like that may delay getting these funds out. So if there's a way that CARB can start that process now, knowing that these incentive amounts will be in place for the most part, or will be approved in November, whether some of that contract negotiation can happen now, so that once November happen, or once that board meeting happens in November, we can implement that quickly and ensure that we don't have any delay in implementation or funding gap. So just hoping that we can work on that. Thinking about now moving to my comments. I saw the mention around the ZAP program, and the ZAP program is one that I've expressed interest in the past. So I'm glad to see that there is now funding for this to move forward. And I welcome CARB's feedback here on what that public process will look like to make sure that we are providing input into the design of the program. That doesn't have to be answered now, but definitely want to see what that process will be so that we can provide input into that program. There was a work group or workshop that happened last week around Clean Cars for All or the light duty clean vehicle incentive programs, where we talked about the need-based approach for the financing assistance program. And I didn't see that reflected at all in this presentation. It is still a policy issue that we want to see resolved, as stated earlier by my colleague Chris over at Coalition for Clean Air. I hear what you said earlier, Lisa, that this is not the last opportunity that we have to engage on this issue, but this is listed as the final workshop that is happening with a lot of these stakeholders on board. So I think it's important that we address this need-based, that we find a solution to this need-based policy decision before an RFP ends up going out that a potential program administrator responds to. So I'll continue to ensure that that's one issue that we resolve. And there was also no mention about the joint solicitation for the two programs, for Clean Cars for All and the Finance Assistance Program. I know we've had multiple conversations in the past, but that wasn't reflected in this presentation, and one that would like to receive an update as to what you are thinking about the joint solicitation and whether, given some of the changes, that is still the path that CARB wants to take. So that's a question for you all. And then, as I mentioned earlier in my early remarks around the outreach and education in July or May, I can't remember the exact date, there was when we presented this initial funding plan based on the May revise, there was a lot of discussion around outreach and education. And I didn't really see much here except for just the decrease in funding for like Access Clean California from 5 to 1 million. And I'd be curious to hear from CARB as to what they're thinking to ensure that we're continuing to improve on our outreach and education efforts for our low income and disadvantaged communities. Now, given the limited amount that will be available for outreach and education, and I know each of the program administrators will have funding for outreach and education, but again, it'd be good to hear what CARB is planning to do with that, or the plan for CARB to continue to increase outreach and education. And then on the 1099 issue, I think this is one that we've continued to raise year in and year out, and it's one that we want to find a solution to that we haven't quite identified a permanent one. And now with the increased amount for incentives in some of these air districts, it becomes even more critical to try to find that solution, because the last thing that we want is to put low-income households in a more difficult situation, because now they have to figure out whether they access a newer card to these programs, or potentially impact another program that they're participating in because they may be bumped out of that. And then lastly, we've been strong proponents of the clean mobility options, around the clean mobility programs or clean mobility investments. It was really unfortunate to see the decreased amount based on the budget for these programs, but definitely still committed to making sure that these are implemented in a way that reflect the needs and priorities of our communities. I think thinking about this transparent and public process, these programs will likely require implementation plan updates or guideline updates like STEP, right? with the new funding. So we'd like to hear, what the process that you all are thinking to receive feedback through a public process on these updated guidelines for these programs. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ramon. So I'm going to do my best to go through your issues. And first, on the process for ZAP, it will be much like the process that we're doing here. There will be work groups. We haven't identified the staff resource that will be working on that just yet, but once we have the lead staff identified, they'll get a work group set up and we'll start bringing folks together to have conversations about what that program looks like. So we've got a lot of work to do and a long way to go. So just stay tuned on that. I'm really glad that you brought up the needs-based process and the joint solicitation, because those are implementation things. So they're not in this workshop because they're not in the funding plan. They were the needs-based program. Moving to a needs-based program was approved by the board last year in last year's funding plan. And so all of the work groups that we have been having over the last few months to design the needs-based mechanism for the financing assistance program and the statewide Clean Cars for All program are a great example of the work that we do outside of the funding plan. The board told us, figure it out. So that's what we're trying to do in those work groups, is figure it out. And in the last work group we showed kind of what our plan is for how we will identify that somebody is needs-based. And that's about as far as we can get without an expert a program administrator to help us now get in the weeds and identify the actual steps. What is it going to look like when a consumer comes in and applies? And how are we going to take them on that journey? How are we going to reach them? How are we going to reach those communities that we haven't reached before? How are we going to take them on that journey and help them get that car and make sure that they get that car with a payment that they can afford, that they're not just jumping into something just because they want to try to get an EV and take advantage of all the incentives, right? We want to help them make sure that it's the right decision for them. But we can't get to that place until we've got our partners and we're continuing the conversation. So once we get our solicitation out there, and we will be having another work group on the joint solicitation later at the end of this month. We haven't announced it yet. We've been working on some of our background materials for that, but we'll announce it with 2 weeks notice here probably pretty soon. And then we'll hopefully get ready to get that solicitation launched. And with regard to outreach and education, you're absolutely right. We haven't had a lot of conversations. We did have a focused conversation about what we're doing in outreach and education in our long-term plan workshop that was held, I believe, in July. So we have had some work groups that did focus on outreach and education, but given the budget, you're correct. We are going to have to make some adjustments there. Not having as much going into the Access Clean California program this year does make it a bit challenging with that particular partnership group. But as you noted so well, we also do have funding within each of our individual projects that can go towards outreach. And we do plan to make a very focused and conscious effort to really get in the communities that we haven't worked with before. And I hope that the partners we've built through this year's process, our partners on the ground, several that represent Bay Area communities and others in the Southern California area that have come to the meetings and are now talking with us. We're really hoping to engage them more, learn about what their communities need, and find others that we're missing. We know that there's a lot of gaps. So that's still an ongoing conversation as well, and one that doesn't have to be finalized through this funding plan process. Last, and I think for your comment and others, the 1099 issue, we agree. We're still, we'll have some updates. We don't have major updates from last time, but we recognize it's an issue and appreciate the comments. We are getting really close to needing a break. So what I want to do is, I know we had one other hand that was up kind of prior. If we can go to that hand and then just take at least a short 5-minute break so that folks managing slides get an opportunity to stand and stretch, that'd be great. So Aria?
Yeah, Mark Roost, I've unmuted your mic. Mark, you'll need to unmute on your end as well. Mark, I am prompting you to unmute. Mark? So Mark is not unmuting himself.
Okay, well then let's go ahead and do a break, and we can come back to Mark when we've got our next opportunity. We will have plenty more opportunities for folks to speak. I know we say return at 5:30. Let's break until 5:35 so that the staff have an opportunity to stretch, and we'll see you all back here in a few minutes.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to our last session of today's workshop. And just a reminder, we're going to go over our last session of the workshop, but we will open it up again for more questions and answers on all the information that was presented today following the heavy duty portion of today's workshop. So I'm now going to introduce my colleague, Andrea Morgan, to present on our heavy duty investments. Andrea.
Thanks, Grace. So as we've discussed, this year's state budget included significant investments in zero emission technologies, and recent amendments to the budget bills that were passed by the legislature last week included additional funding for heavy duty on-road vehicles and off-road equipment. The recently passed budget bills included $60 million to reduce emissions from commercial harbor craft, subject to the commercial harbor craft regulation, $53 million for emerging opportunities, and an additional $82 million for drayage trucks. To account for these additional investments, staff are considering the revised allocations shown on the slide. The funds for commercial harbor craft and emerging opportunities will be administered through our demonstration and pilot projects. Staff are also considering increasing the allocation for our clean off-road equipment project, known as CORE, in response to high demand at its recent reopening. Additionally, per legislative direction, $82 million will be added to the Hvip set aside for drayage trucks. Next, we'll discuss the new funding for commercial harbor craft that will be administered through our demonstration and pilot projects. As I mentioned earlier, $60 million in funding has been appropriated to fund commercial harbor craft regulation compliance, with $40 million coming from the state's general fund and $20 million coming from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Per legislative direction, the goal of the funding is to maximize emission reductions from vessels subject to the commercial harbor craft regulation, with a priority given to Public Utility Commission regulated private ferries, public ferries, licensed commercial fishing vessels, research, and excursion vessels. The funding will be used to showcase commercial harbor craft regulation compliant technologies, which includes fully zero emission capable, and commercially available Tier 4 and Tier 3 engines as required by the regulation. Now, moving on to discuss policy changes to Hvip. Following stakeholder feedback, additional data on Hvip demand, and legislative direction, staff is considering significant changes to the fleet size limits in Hvip. Staff is considering adjusting the timeline for fleet size limit implementation to align with the requirements in the Advanced Clean Fleet Regulation, and introducing a suite of additional changes in the interim to respond to challenges faced by small fleets, support equitable investments, encourage deployments of zero emission technologies in disadvantaged communities, manage demand within Hvip, and help to expand the market for zero emission vehicles in advance of regulatory deadlines. Specifically, staff is considering deferring the effective dates of the fleet size limits until January 1st, 2024, and limiting Hvip to fleets of 50 or fewer at that time. The same exemptions for public fleets and Native American tribal governments and new to market technologies such as fuel cell vehicles would continue to apply. This would allow larger fleets to continue to have access to Hvip funds in 2023, encouraging adoption before the Advanced Clean Fleet's regulatory requirements take effect. To ensure that the medium and small fleets continue to have access to Hvip incentives, staff is considering reserving 70% of the Hvip standard funds for private fleets with 100 vehicles or less, and all public fleets. If funding remains in the reserve, it would be opened approximately quarterly to minimize disruptions to the market. Staff is also considering modifying voucher amounts to stretch Hvip dollars further, while still recognizing the unique needs of the smallest fleets in the state. Specifically, staff is considering implementing a modest increase in the voucher amount for fleets with 10 vehicles or fewer, while reducing voucher amounts for private fleets with more than 100 vehicles as shown on the screen. The voucher amounts for private fleets with more than the voucher amounts for private fleets with between 11 and 100 vehicles and public fleets with more than 10 vehicles will remain the same as it is currently. Staff are also considering exempting new to market technologies such as fuel cell vehicles from the voucher reductions. These modifications would adjust the base voucher amount, meaning that these adjustments would be made prior to applying other voucher modifiers. Staff is also considering recategorizing the plug-in hybrid and in-use converted remanufactured voucher modifiers so that they are applied prior to application of other voucher modifiers. Staff is also considering allowing small fleets with 10 vehicles or fewer to stack funding with other state incentive programs, such as the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust and the Carl Moyer program. Finally, staff is considering implementing new bulk purchase requirements for private fleets with more than 500 vehicles. Large purchases of zero-emission vehicles encourage manufacturers to scale up their assembly lines and support economies of scale. Specifically, staff is considering requiring that private fleets with more than 500 vehicles present a purchase order for at least 30 Hvip eligible vehicles, and that the Hvip incentive be applied for each vehicle purchase above 30. The existing voucher request limit of 30 vouchers per fleet per year, or 50 vouchers for drayage trucks, continues to apply. So for example, if a fleet with 600 vehicles purchases 55 zero-emission vehicles, they would be eligible to receive 25 Hvip vouchers. The initial 30 vehicles and all vehicles that receive Hvip vouchers must be domiciled and operated in California. Additionally, staff is considering setting the Hvip voucher amount for these large fleets to 50% of the base voucher amount, and requiring that all vehicles receiving an Hvip voucher be domiciled in a disadvantaged community. And finally, we will discuss updates to the Carl Moyer program guidelines. The Carl Moyer program is a statewide district-run program that is part of CARB's suite of incentive programs and complements low carbon transportation incentives. The Carl Moyer program provides grants that fund up to the incremental cost of cleaner than required engines, equipment, and emission reduction technology. Eligible projects include a wide variety of equipment, such as on-road trucks and off-road equipment, such as construction, agricultural, cargo handling equipment, marine vessels, and locomotives. Emission reductions must be SIP credible, above and beyond, or before it is required by regulation, and are constrained by cost effectiveness limits. The current cost effectiveness limit for advanced technology zero emission projects is $109,000 per ton. Staff are proposing to increase the cost effectiveness limit for off-road zero emission projects to $500,000 per ton. This level is consistent with an increase approved by our board last year for on-road zero emission trucks. This increase would ensure the Carl Moyer program provides meaningful incentives for zero emission off-road equipment and assists in the transition to cleaner technologies in all sectors. With that, we will open it up for questions and comments. I'll turn it over to my colleague Aria.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. For those of you joining Zoom via the Zoom platform, please use the raise hand feature to raise your hand. For those of you joining by phone, please press pound or #2 to raise your hand. When you're called on, please state your name and affiliation. So we do have some raised hands from the light duty section, but I'm going to take heavy duty questions and comments first, and then I will return to the light duty comments after we've gone through all the heavy duty comments. So first up is Bill McGavern. Bill, I've unmuted your mic.
Thanks very much. Bill McGavern with the Coalition for Clean Air. And we generally support what you're proposing. Some of the details are new, so I won't, give a blanket support for every detail. in the proposal, but in particular, it's a good breakdown overall of where the funding would go. And in HVIP, it makes a lot of sense to align the fleet size limits with the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, which is a very high priority for us. We always want to see the incentives supporting the regulation. And also the fact that you're trying to gear the incentives towards the very smallest fleets. That's something that we have been calling for a few years. So we support that direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.
Next up, we have Andy Schwartz. Andy, I've unmuted your mic.
Hey, thank you and good evening. Yeah, Andy Schwartz with Tesla. First, I want to thank ARB staff for hosting this workshop and for the opportunity to provide feedback. I do have a number of comments and questions. So maybe I'll start with the limit to the budget for larger fleets. We're concerned that by limiting the budget so drastically, these fleets are going to face the same uncertainty regarding the availability of funding that we've understood CARB and CARB staff have sought to eliminate from the program. From an investment standpoint, HVIP funds for larger fleets, if limited as proposed, will be effectively turned into a lottery, impairing the ability to leverage these funds to drive investment decisions. So I guess with that in mind, I'm curious if you can share sort of the analytical basis for why the 70-30 split, particularly when, when I looked at the data on voucher requests and where demand was coming from, that CARB's provided for both 2021 and 2022, well over half the demand for vouchers was coming from fleets that exceeded 100 vehicles.
Sure, Andy, happy to speak to that a bit. So looking at the reserve, 30% would be available to fleets of all sizes and to larger fleets with more than 100 vouchers. Up through July of this year, private fleets that had more than 100 vehicles requested about $128 million. The reserve would allow for $126.6 million to be available right away. And then we anticipate that it would we'd continue to add funds to the reserve open up the reserve to larger fleets about quarterly if funding remained. So really what we're seeing here and what we're suggesting is pretty close to what we've seen actual demand within HVIP be. So we do suspect that we would be able to fund the large fleets that are coming in, particularly since we have voucher reductions also being considered as part of this overarching proposal.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. I guess I'm still struggling to square the 70-30 split with the actual demand that you're seeing in the program based on data you've provided. But appreciate the response here. The next issue that I wanted to delve into were the pretty restrictive set of eligibility requirements and criteria that you're proposing to apply to larger fleets, which frankly I think are going to function like a de facto categorical exclusion of these very large fleets from the program. And honestly, I don't think that is in keeping with the spirit of the recently adopted budget control language. So here again, I'm just kind of looking for sort of the basis for some of the decisions that are being, or some of the proposals that are being put forward. For example, the 50% discount factor that's proposed to be applied to the very large fleets. Again, I'm just curious if there's sort of a basis, grounded in, is there some evidence or empirical data to suggest that the economics of these vehicles for these very, very large fleets are so superior to those of other fleet sizes to justify such a steep discount?
Yeah, so we're looking at a number of factors when we're proposing these reductions in voucher amounts for larger fleets. One, as you've heard us talk about earlier, we know that the total cost of ownership is something that larger fleets are able to take more advantage of. Additionally, as I'm sure you're aware, the Inflation Reduction Act includes some additional tax credits for folks purchasing zero emission heavy duty vehicles. And we understand that larger fleets will be more able to really take into account those tax credits in their overall purchasing decisions. Whereas smaller fleets that are much more limited by capital and making that upfront purchase decision might not be able to weigh those additional credits into their purchase decision quite as easily. So that's largely in part what's driving this, is just our understanding based off of what other incentives are available and the total cost of ownership of vehicles and what drives purchase decisions of fleets of different sizes. So we really consider these voucher reductions to be a pretty moderate approach, where you have some of the largest fleets who have much higher available capital seeing more substantial reductions, and then the more in-between fleet sizes of the 100 to 500 seeing a smaller reduction, and other fleets keeping at pace of what we have offered Hvip vouchers for in the past.
Yeah, it just seems, I mean, the 50% discount seems incredibly high. And, I think Tesla and others have proposed haircuts to the incentive, but, certainly 50% seems to be, quite draconian and potentially premature. I mean, it sounds like ARB staff is kind of speculating kind of the impact of, the IRA on the cost of these vehicles. But there's no, data right now to support, the type of changes that CARB is proposing to impose. And then lastly, I realize I'm taking a bit of time here. Lastly, I'm also curious about the minimum purchase order requirement. This appears to assume that larger fleets will be willing to purchase a significant number of vehicles without an incentive, and also seems to ignore that many large fleet operators may want to take a more cautious approach to incorporating heavy-duty ZEVs into their fleets. And I just don't understand why CARB wouldn't want to support entities, even large ones, taking an approach of dipping their toes into the ZEV waters rather than requiring them to sort of jump head first before offering any support at all.
Yeah, that's a great question. With the bulk purchase requirement, overall, our goal is really to start getting economies of scale within the zero emission vehicle manufacturing, and really encourage manufacturers to ramp up their assembly lines as quickly as possible. We incorporated this provision only for fleets with 500 or more vehicles, just on a basis of looking at what average fleet turnover would be. So essentially our goal here is to have some of these larger fleets that will likely be subject to regulatory requirements, as ACF is considered by our board, start making the transition now with their entire fleet and helping us get as many zero emission vehicles as possible on the roads in California, particularly within our disadvantaged communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly support the goal of encouraging those entities to purchase those vehicles. I just don't know if sort of requiring them to, jump as much as you're expecting them to without any support at all really makes sense if that is your objective. Anyway, I appreciate the time this evening. Again, appreciate the opportunity to provide feedback. Is there an opportunity to submit written comments in response to the current staff proposal?
Yes, we will happily accept written comments on what we're discussing today. So I believe that there will be some contact information at the end of the slides. So you can submit them to Grace, or I'm more than happy to take written comments myself on anything related to the Hvip provisions.
Great, thanks so much.
All right, thank you. Next up, I'm going to allow Lonnie Mason to talk. I know that you had your hand up for light duty, but I think you also typically have heavy duty comments as well. So the floor is yours, Lonnie.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I usually do. But you guys might have answered this, because I had a distraction. First of all, thank you for providing this, platform. And my name is Lonnie Mason. I'm the Executive Director of First Generation Environmental Health of the Bayview Hunters Point community and supporting the Bayview Hunters Point community. If this might have been said, for the scrap vehicles, right? I wanted to know, did they increase the rebate? on that scrap, rebate for if anyone wanted to actually, turn in one of their old vehicles, right? What would be the rebate for them, turning in their vehicle to get a newer vehicle or a used vehicle? And also, when is this program going to start for individuals to be able to scrap their vehicles and be able to take advantage of the rebate in the disadvantaged communities?
Thanks, Lonnie.
Oh, there you go, Lisa. I didn't see. I thought you were gone. All right, there you go.
Well,
All right, thank you.
I'm hanging out in the background until we get back to light duty. But what I'll tell you right now is, and then if you don't mind, if it's okay, while we get through some more heavy duty things, then we can bring the table up. We do have a table that shows what the new incentive amounts will be.
Okay.
And how they will stack. If you do scrap a car and you buy a new EV, it'll show how you can take advantage of the multiple programs and what the total incentive is. So once we're done with this piece, we'll bring that back up for you. So hang tight. But on timing, the programs or most of the programs, financing assistance is still closed, but the other programs, Clean Cars for All within the districts are open. The statewide program and financing assistance can't open until we get our solicitation ran and bring our administrator on board and then get our final terms and conditions and things finalized. And so we're going to be working on that in the next several months. We do want to try to get those programs open as soon as possible.
So you can't give me a ballpark figure, huh?
I can't yet. I'm so sorry. It really just, there's a lot of different things at play. We do have, our paperwork is in-house right now, the things we have to do to be able to launch it, and we are hoping to have things ready. But we try also not to have solicitations open when we also have an open board item. So we could run it right now, but I think we are still working through a few more little things. And so what we will likely do is run the solicitation right after the board hearing is done. Again, because we can't really talk about the projects publicly when we're running a solicitation in an effort to keep a level playing field for everybody that might be applying. And so we'll probably wait till just after the board hearing and then get it launched. And again, like after that, there's so many different things in play, but we will be working hard to get them open as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you for that. Can you remind me of the board hearing? When does that take place?
November 17th.
November 17th. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
And the reason why we need to wait is because the board is approving the funding amounts that we're talking about today. And those are the funding amounts that we would use in our solicitation. And so it's really important to get that board buy-off as well when we are running a solicitation.
Okay. Thank you.
You bet. And hang tight. We will go back to those other slides in just a little bit.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you. Lonnie, I'm gonna leave your hand raised for now. Jamie Levin, we have unmuted your mic.
Thank you very much. Jamie Levin with the Center for Transportation and the Environment. Andrea, thank you for the presentation. As you know, CTE is pretty heavily engaged in deploying what will be the largest fuel cell Class 8 truck fleet out of the Port of Oakland. The good news on this is we're deploying vehicles that have proven commercial success overseas with a long, extensive range up to 500 miles, a higher payload, although I wish even higher, but still a pretty significant payload, close to 40,000 pounds, and the ability to refuel these vehicles very quickly within 10 minutes in order to cycle them through. These are all good technology readiness factors. But what we are finding is the reality. You talked about total cost of ownership, and that underlies all of our goals to commercialize this technology. And I really have concerns about achieving those goals if we cannot continue to subsidize, incentivize large fleet procurements that will drive the volumes. In order to get the capital costs of the vehicles down, there's still a very big gap, whether it's battery electric, more so with fuel cell electric. There's still a very big gap that doesn't make it affordable easily for the fleet operator, with any fleet operator, let alone a small fleet operator. you have to think of all the components that go in to buying a truck or leasing a truck, which many do, beyond the capital costs or the leasing costs for that vehicle, the ability to insure that vehicle so that if it's destroyed for whatever reason, it can be replaced so that the fleet operator isn't losing revenue. And the cost of insurance is prohibitive. And it isn't going to change until there's more of a track record. I mean, that's the business of insurance. But the administrative operating costs to take on the risk of a new technology that can prove itself, even our project, which has all those benefits I just mentioned, still has to show the industry, down to the single small fleet operator, that it works, that it's reliable, that their uptime is matched with diesel. So where I'm getting at is by driving these incentive rebates further down, by assuming that there's going to be this big volume consumption, by spreading the money out, by not, and maybe I'm presuming more than I should here, understanding where the OEMs are. What is it going to take for these large OEMs that are in the business of making trucks to reach those economies of scale that you mentioned? And I can tell you, it isn't going to be with 1,000 truck order on their online production. We're talking about scales that are much bigger than that drive supply chain. And I'm a little worried that with all your good goals and intentions, ultimately what's going to get that TCO down is that we really can accelerate early entry volumes, which means higher incentives for the fleet operators, giving the large fleet operators that capability because they've got at least the wherewithal to carry the return on investment over more than a year or two, where a small fleet operator can't afford that. Sorry to run on there, but it's just the exasperation of just what it takes to get 30 trucks to operate over a 6-year period. That's our project, not 1 year, but 6 years. And I'm afraid that the proposed new guidelines under Hvip are not going to carry the day. And I'll stop with that.
Thanks for your comments, Jamie.
Thank you. Next up, we have Mark Roost. Mark, I'm going to unmute your mic.
Thank you. Mark Roost with Sustainable Energy Inc. and Enhanced Mobility Corporation. And questions. So the advanced technology demonstration and pilots for heavy duty vehicles, medium duty vehicles, how do we get funding for technology demos? And there's 2 levels to this. One is for a new conversion that's actually being done right now on a class 3 box truck. And the other is for batteries for conversions. And so the other question that goes with that is, in the new regime here, can we scrap a diesel engine? And in which cases can we scrap a diesel engine and replace it with a full battery electric conversion and not scrap the truck? Because that, in volume, that'll cut the cost by 2/3. And hopefully it'll be competitive starting out at low volume. So let's start with those 2 questions.
Hi, Mark. This is Jason Crow. And I think there are at least 3 different possible ways to approach what you're talking about. We do have vouchers through Hvip that fund conversions. We do have other scrap and replace programs, such as through the Moyer program. where you're scrapping an existing vehicle and replacing it with a cleaner one. And then we do have demonstration and pilot projects, which typically do not have a scrap component. Those are typically where it's the newest technology and we want to be able to showcase it or demonstrate it, see that it works, collect a lot of data on it, and then move it on to the next stage where it becomes a pilot and it's demonstrated in greater numbers. And in the demonstration and pilot category for this year's funding plan, we do have 7 different categories of projects listed in the funding plan that your project could potentially fall under. Otherwise, for just a pure conversion on a 1 or 2 or a handful of truck basis, you might be more interested in the HVIP or on scrap and replace. Again, it could be a program like Moyer, or it could be through VW or any number of programs within our larger transportation incentive portfolio. So it might be better if we talk offline, but we do have a number of programs going forward in this year's funding plan that could potentially do those different things.
Okay, Jason. Should I email you or phone you to start this off?
Feel free to shoot me an email with your thoughts and we can set up time to talk if that works too.
Jason.crow@ARB?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I'll do that because we've got a bunch of stuff starting to happen now.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Next up, we have Teresa. Teresa, I have unmuted your mic.
Thank you so much. This is Teresa Bowie with Pacific Environment. We are an environmental nonprofit with a consultative status on with the International Maritime Organization, and we supported CARB's Harborcraft rule. We were supportive of the funding for the Harborcraft through the California legislature process, and look forward to the draft funding proposal in October. But right now, I just wanted to emphasize the need for this funding to go out as soon as possible so that we can help to accelerate the transition of zero emission Harborcraft. And then I do have a question in terms of the core program. Right now there's 0 Harborcraft that's eligible, and I was just wondering if you can expand on why. There is it lack of interest, or what's the barrier there?
I can touch on that real quick. This is Todd Sterling, talk about core. Yeah, we had commercial Harborcraft open in core since the beginning. That opened up in July. We had some workshops or work groups before that, and had some I thought some really good meetings with some zero emission powertrain manufacturers for commercial Harborcraft, but nobody's applied. So I started reaching out to the commercial Harborcraft rule staff, trying to figure out how we can get folks that can still apply to the program and get in the program, how we can do that. So Teresa, if you know somebody that's interested or think about that a powertrain manufacturer that's zero emission that could fit into the core space, I'm all ears. My name is Todd Sterling. You can send me an email at todd.sterling@arb.ca.gov, and I'd love to get you in the program.
Great, and thank you so much for hosting this workshop. It's been super helpful. Thank you.
Next up, we have Adam Browning. Adam, I've unmuted your mic.
Thank you. Adam Browning with Forum Mobility. We're a service provider working on electrifying drayage. A couple of questions. First, I wondered if you had any updates on the number of vouchers issued for drayage, the vouchers redeemed, and fleet size thereof. And this is kind of getting to the proposed restrictions around fleet sizes going forward. As we've sort of conversed and submitted before, if you really want to address the small fleets, it's really important to have a program that really works for them. And your ISEP program has been wonderful, but I noticed that you haven't yet increased the amount of funding that goes into the ISEP. And so I'm just trying to see if there's been more uptake for the small fleets with the main HVIP program, which was the rationale for that first request.
Thanks, Adam. That's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have updated numbers with me tonight on drayage truck requests, though I believe we did have a decent number through ISEF. But that is something I can look into and get back to you on.
Awesome. I would also just, one further question around that. Would, you propose some adjustments for fleet size, and I'm just wondering if that would also apply to ISEF applicants as well, or how that would work.
Yeah, so what I expect will be happening with ISEF is that over the course of the next year, after the funding plan is approved or adopted by our board, we'll continue to have implementation work groups. At this point, we're not ready to make any changes to voucher amounts in ISEF, which I should specify for everybody stands for Innovative Small E-Fleets, and is really an effort designed to help support the smallest fleets in the state make the transition to zero emission. But we do expect that, particularly as we get more information, since ISEF just recently launched last week, we'll take that data back to stakeholders and have an open work group process to discuss any changes to the program and changes to voucher amounts for the coming year.
Got it. I mean, just to, not to belabor the obvious here, but we're looking at in 5 months, you're gonna, see, good 7,000 diesel trucks dropping off the drayage registry. And so it's a now issue that this program is awesome and plans to scale that so that it's, goes beyond a pilot and it can actually, put a large dent into the servicing the population that really needs it would be wonderful. And that's not an 18-month process. It's a 5-month window. So thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to converse with you on this.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Greg Herner. Greg, I've unmuted your mic.
Hello, Greg Herner, and I'm talking on behalf of the Sport Fishing Association of California. And Andrea, thank you for your words. The title of slide 27 concerned me because the Sport Fishing Association has obviously been extraordinarily active in requesting funding for the commercial hovercraft rule. And you did mention that the designed path forward for us to achieve future zero and hybrid emissions by going through the best available technology is available. So that was, your comments were very helpful in that, as I misread from the title of the slide that we weren't going to be eligible. I want to echo kind of some of Teresa's comments on the core program. I think that there's a lot of work to do in the commercial hovercraft space, and if there's anything that we can do to help facilitate getting the core program up and more interest in it for commercial hovercraft, I know that there are operators out there that are interested in funds if the manufacturers come in and do that. But maybe there's some ways that we can work with you on that program to make sure that those operators that are out there looking for that funding have a way to get it through that program, because we will exhaust the 60 million very quickly. Hopefully we can work with you on additional funding for next year as well. But really appreciate this workshop, and we will continue to be engaged with you throughout this process. Thank you.
Mr. Herner, this is Todd Sterling with the core program again. Yeah, reach out to me. Love to talk to you and hear about potential zero emission powertrain manufacturers that can fit in this space. That'd be really good to talk to you guys. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to give everyone a heads up that we have 7 more raised hands, and we'll begin taking comments on other topics after that. So anything that we've covered tonight, including light duty. So feel free to raise your hand because you will get called on for light duty or anything else. With that, our next speaker is Eileen Tutt. Eileen, I have unmuted your mic.
Thank you. This is Eileen Tutt with the California Electric Transportation Coalition. I just want to say something because I've heard this throughout this conversation today, and it's not really been addressed by staff at all. So I would like to ask the question, which is, we provided some very some suggested recommendations for how you could modify Hvip that would both accelerate the market, increase benefits in disadvantaged communities, and benefit small fleets. And we've really never gotten a response back from our suggestions. And part of our suggestions were that the recommendations that you're making will actually not increase or accelerate the market. In fact, on some level, if I heard Andrea correctly, you're almost suppressing the demand by only allowing 30% of the funds to go to large fleets, and then assuming that a reserve will build up over time that then can be accessed, which of course, I'm not sure how that works because the large fleets are only in the program for 1 year. So it is a little confusing, but there's this kind of suggestion that you want to like almost decelerate the market. There's no indication of whether or not small fleets and focusing more money per truck on small fleets will actually benefit air quality or disadvantaged communities. And we, by the way, totally support setting aside funding for small fleets. We just think staff's recommendations actually will reduce the benefits to communities, reduce the pollution, benefits, and will decrease the acceleration of the market. So we're concerned about this, and so we've made some suggestions about how to address both of those. Well, really all three of those things. You've come back with limiting the large fleets to only 30% of the funding, even though your own data shows they take about a little over half of the money. So what you're doing again is you're suppressing the availability of that funding, which is, in my opinion, counter to what the legislative direction was in the budget. And you're you're assuming that at a later date, when there's a reserve, these fleets will be able to access the funding, when by that point they won't be in the program anymore. So I also want to say there's this talk of alignment with the Clean Fleet Regulation, which, by the way, we totally support. I mean, we are 100% support of the fleet regulation, but it hasn't been adopted yet, and it's extremely controversial. And I just want to say that I am, holding my breath in hopes that it will be adopted as it's proposed, but I don't know if it will or not. So you're assuming that in the adoption of this plan, and you're also assuming that large fleets will make this massive investment. We're not talking about a modification. We're talking about a truck that's twice as expensive and also a brand new technology. So it feels like there's this, I think Jamie Levin said it best, there's this lack of recognition about how the market works, and CARB hasn't presented any data that would suggest the market in this case is going to work differently, and that somehow these incentives are the key to the market succeeding, which is just not true. I mean, the truth is the technology's got to succeed, and we don't know if it's going to or not, and the ACF or these incentives aren't going to guarantee that. What we need is big investments by the private sector that are leveraged by your public sector investments, and I don't see that happening here. So I guess what I'm asking you is, do you have any data that would suggest that your recommendations give us greater benefits, environmental benefits, or benefit small fleets better than our recommendations, which we have shown do both?
Hi, Eileen. So I'd like to start off by addressing your first concern that I heard was about the reserve, or 30% of funds being available for the larger fleets. when HVIP first opens. So I'll go back to what I was telling Zach or earlier on, or Andy, excuse me, about how we came to that number. Essentially, while yes, what you said is correct, that larger fleets have been taking up a larger percentage of the dollar amounts, when we actually look at how many dollars will be available when HVIP reopens next year for larger fleets, we are matching the dollar amount that fleets have requested this year. And we do anticipate opening up that reserve approximately quarterly. So that's a way for us to balance some of the concerns that we have heard from stakeholders that HVIP becomes a lottery type system where suddenly all the funding is gone and fleets cannot access those dollars. So by allowing HVIP to moderately open up to some of the larger fleets, it allows fleets that have different procurement cycles to continue to have access to those funds throughout the year and not just be taken up by the first chunk of larger fleets. As we consider having this reserve for small fleets and for public agencies to really be of critical importance, because we know that these fleets have challenges with procurement cycles. We hear this all the time from our public agency partners that they need funding to be available when they're ready to make that purchase. And it's challenging for them to be ready to make that purchase because of how public procurement processes work or because of their budget cycles. So we want to make sure that those fleets that are also subject to various regulations and need support have access to those funds. And on the smaller fleet side, we know as well that it is very true that these smaller fleets are very sensitive to both timing and price concerns. So we do think that this reserve and 30% is based off of numbers that we have seen today through HVIP and through HVIP demand, and that it is responsive to the needs of both the medium and the larger fleets within the HVIP program. So hopefully that helps address your question. I think when I say we're thinking about it opening quarterly, it would be approximately every 3 months after HVIP opens up the first time with these new dollars in. So we're not just holding these funds until 2024. Larger fleets will have access to it throughout the year. It's just a way for us to make sure that those fleets that have a harder time tracking when incentive dollars become available have access to the funding as well.
Yeah, and I think we just don't agree, but I will say that I think it does still, what you're saying is you're decelerating the market for large fleets because there is less, certainty around that, and then that does concern us. I also would say I agree with the commenter who said this 50% cut in incentive amounts after they've already purchased 30 trucks paying the full. I mean, these trucks, let's be real, are twice as expensive. So these numbers this 50% reduction, where's the data that shows that will actually work? That, I feel like there's just a lot of changes being made to the program that really, really restrict the funding in a way that's going to harm the market, and not just for large fleets, but also for small fleets that rely on used trucks from large fleets. So we're talking about, why are we cutting the percentages by so much relative to what we suggested, which we felt was really reasonable, and now you're saying basically we're going to cut the incentive amount, and then even has to domicile in disadvantaged communities. I just don't understand that. Why not show that they demonstrate benefits in those communities? What if they're just domiciled there, but they deliver in all high income communities? I feel like, where's the data that shows that this benefits communities, it benefits air quality, and is more cost effective? That's all I'm asking. And I feel like we just haven't gotten those questions answered.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at, so we have run some preliminary numbers on what the proposal that your group put together would result in terms of new vehicles versus what ours would. We certainly believe that our proposal would result in more vehicles being on the road. And as I had mentioned earlier, the Inflation Reduction Act is something that we're considering as additional incentives that will be available to fleets of all size, but that larger fleets are best able to actualize and see the benefits of upfront. So we certainly are looking at the proposals that you have put forth and taking them into consideration as we're taking into consideration all stakeholder feedback.
Next up, we have Dan Shaw. Dan, I've unmuted your mic.
Great, thank you so much. Dan Chaw with Chaw Strategies representing Arrival Automotive. I'll align my comments with Eileen, Andy, Jamie. Won't belabor their comments too much, but I do think, you know, the frustration that you're hearing in the broader Hvip kind of community, the coalition that CalETC has put together. What underlies all that is a lot of it is just the lack of any data that would demonstrate or justify some level of effectiveness, greater level of effectiveness, greater level of deployments, anything that we can react to and respond to. And so in the absence of that, it really does feel that staff is making arbitrary decisions. And that's in part why the coalition sought the assistance of the legislature, because we don't feel like we were being listened to, or at the very least, presented with any, contrary data that's based on substantial evidence, or based on any evidence. And so there is a concern that this proposal does run contrary to the legislature's intent. And, some of us on this call, we're right there. So we believe we have a decent finger on the pulse of the legislature's intent. So I'll sort of stop there in terms of higher level concerns. Andrea, you had mentioned, I think in response to Andy's question, that through July, large fleets, presuming that means 100 and above, asked for 128 million in voucher incentives, and then that would be matched the first quarter that Hvip reopens. Is that accurate?
Yes, so larger private fleets throughout Hvip last year had requested, or through July of this year, had requested about $128 million in vouchers. In total, the 30% of the reserve, which is what we're proposing for, or 30% of the total Hvip funds that we are proposing be allocated next year, would total to about $126.6 million. So we think that this is a pretty fair match, and would align pretty closely with what we are suggesting be available to those larger fleets when Hvip first opens. And particularly when you consider in any reductions in voucher amounts, we think that that would leave some wiggle room for those larger fleets leading up to when we would be opening up the reserve for larger fleets after the first quarter.
And so that doesn't seem to be, 126 doesn't seem to be 30% of 265, which is the number that was in the slide deck. So what am I missing? What is there a larger number for Hvip standard?
Yes. So this would be both including this Hvip standard and the drayage truck set aside. So that's an additional $157 million.
Oh, I see. So the 126 then, of the 126, how much would be available for Hvip standard?
Let me do some math. So that's 0.365. So it'd be about $80 million from HVIP standard.
Okay. Which is roughly, which is 30, which is the math that I, the result of the math that I calculated, 30% of 265. So, okay, that makes sense. And can you clarify more about the reserve? What if, are you saying that if at the end of a particular time frame, certain levels of money aren't fully subscribed, that the balance would be made available to large fleets every quarter?
So we envision within the reserve a portion of that would then become, if funding remains, a portion of that would become available to larger fleets approximately quarterly. So essentially this is similar to requests that we have gotten from all sorts of stakeholders, that rather than just having HVIP open once, have it open multiple times throughout the year. So this would in effect be a way for us to make sure that we're continuing to provide different opportunities for large fleets to open or to access HVIP funds throughout the year, while also ensuring that some of those smaller fleets and public agencies have continuous access to HVIP dollars.
So would the reserve be funded by the 70%? That's not a portion of which may not be taken up by small and medium fleets?
Yes. So let me clarify. When I say reserve, I'm referring to that 70%. So that would be what we're considering the reserve for small and medium fleets, is that 70%. So throughout the year, we would take portions of that if funding remained and open it up for larger fleets to have access to.
Got it. Okay, very helpful. Thank you for that clarification. And at this point, do you have a rough estimate as to what percentage would be made available to, what percentage of the 70% would be made available to the large fleets? Or like what would be the trigger such that large fleets could access that money?
Yeah, so the trigger would be if a certain amount was available within a time period. And so I believe we were thinking that would be if 100 million or more was available in July, we would open up 30% of that to larger fleets. And then as we approached October, we would open up the entire remaining amount to fleets of all sizes.
Got it. I'm just taking notes. Thank you. Okay, that's very, very helpful. And moving on to the bulk fleet requirements, bulk purchase requirements. Arrival is also concerned with the effect of these multiple requirements that do seem pretty unreasonable or infeasible. I'm curious how, I think in particular, the purchase order for more than 30 vehicles, how did you arrive at that number, and why that presumes a purchase would have to be made from one OEM, which, at this early stage, a lot of fleets aren't only going with one OEM, right? They're talking to many, testing out a handful of vehicles. It's far too early to just make one sort of purchase decision. So is there an openness to, assuming this moves forward, openness to, at least allow a large fleet owner operator to purchase, whatever the number may be, but from different OEMs on a whatever time basis, annual basis, or however it can be crafted. But so two concerns. One, two questions. One, where the 30 vehicle number come from? And then is there flexibility on the purchase order side?
Yeah, so both great questions. What I would say with the 30 vehicle number is we looked at a number of different factors, and really we see this as affecting a relatively small portion of the fleets that request vouchers through Hvip. More of our fleets fall within the less than 100 category than fleets over 500. I think about 79% of fleets who've requested Hvip vouchers this year are either private fleets with less than 100 vehicles or public fleets who would not be subject to these requirements. But so for those larger private fleets, really our goal here was to pick a number that would help us leverage more private capital, but still provide some incentive to these larger fleets to purchase zero emission vehicles and start doing so at a bigger scale so that they're getting to almost the point of having turning over their fleets in the normal sort of turnover cycles to zero emission vehicles as opposed to diesel or other combustion alternatives. With respect to the question about if we could be flexible on multiple OEMs, I think that that is something that we'd certainly be willing to have further discussions on. And really our main goal here is to start supporting more zero emission vehicles being deployed in California.
Right. Thank you for that openness on the latter piece. So on the 30, then did you have conversations with the OEMs or fleet owner operators? Was it survey data? Like where did that actual number come from?
Yeah, so in part by getting to that number and the 500, we're looking at things like large entity data reporting from the ACT regulation, which suggests that on average, fleets turn over their vehicles most fleets turn over their vehicles in less than 10 years, particularly. We'd expect to see that with some of the larger fleets. So that is largely where we came to that number. As well as some discussions with other stakeholders. We're certainly hearing feedback on this tonight, and we'll continue to take that into consideration as well. I do want to note we are getting pretty close to time, and we have quite a number of folks who have raised hands. So Dan, I'm more than happy to continue this conversation.
Thank you. I will rest my case.
All right, so we're now going to open it up for discussion. So if folks want to ask any questions or make a comment on any of the information that's been covered here today, please go ahead and raise your hand. So I'm going to hand it back to Aria.
Thank you. Next up, we have Tom Van Heek. Tom, I've unmuted your mic.
Hey, thank you. Good evening. Tom Van Heek with Rivian. Dan, Eileen, Andy, and others have all made a number of points tonight very eloquently that I'll just generally align myself with. Rivian is concerned that some of what we're seeing here in the proposals does not conform with legislative intent. I think some of what you're proposing in terms of requirements, it's perhaps well-intentioned, but I do want to underscore what we see as significant risks, absent an empirical basis to justify some of what we're hearing. On that point, a question perhaps for staff, just so I don't take up too much time here. Does CARB have data to demonstrate that the domiciling requirement you're imagining will lead to air quality benefits accruing disproportionately in those communities? Or conversely, that fleets that are domiciled in other areas deliver no benefits to disadvantaged communities in terms of improved air quality and are therefore unworthy of support? Just want to try to understand a bit, where that, you're, I think, imagining a proxy there, but I want to get a sense of whether there's data or some other basis for making that assumption.
So yes, we do collect data, telematics data for vehicles within HVIP and look at those vehicles that are domiciled within disadvantaged communities compared to those vehicles that are not domiciled in disadvantaged communities. And we do have that as a point of comparison for how many miles are driven in disadvantaged communities by each of those vehicle types. While I don't have that data in front of me today, we do typically see that those vehicles that are domiciled in disadvantaged communities on average do drive more in disadvantaged communities, which is not unexpected since as we define disadvantaged or domiciled, it's typically the location that a given vehicle returns to every night. So those vehicles are typically having to drive through a disadvantaged community on at least a daily basis or so in order to park their vehicle that night. So happy to take another look at that data, but that is something that we have collected and we do believe it to be a reasonable way for us to be trying to prioritize and achieve more emission benefits in disadvantaged communities.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's helpful. I guess it sounds like you've done some of that analysis. That's terrific, both on that point, but then I think more generally, you mentioned maybe one or two responses ago, Andrea, that you've done other analysis investigating the market impact of the proposals you're demonstrating here tonight versus what the CalETC coalition has put together, and that you have reason to believe that your proposed requirements would generate a greater market impact and greater benefits. Are any of those shareable to stakeholders in some format or another, so we can just have a chance to digest those in advance of submitting perhaps a written response?
So what I will say is some of our data on incremental cost and cost information is pretty confidential and shared with us by manufacturers with that understanding. So there may be some data that we are not able to share. We'll certainly take a look at what we may be able to share and see what we can do.
I understand. That makes sense. Well, okay. That's all really helpful. Let me just close by just thanking you all for putting this together. I know it's late and continue to find these opportunities really helpful. It's a good chance for us to learn and interact with you all and get more information. So do appreciate this and thanks for taking the time.
Okay, before we go to the next raised hand, we're gonna go back to slide 20. Requested earlier by Lonnie Mason. Lonnie, this is the slide that shows the stacked incentive amounts if you participate in the programs. And the top part, the first table is if you participate in the financing assistance program, and then also get CVRP on top of that for a new vehicle. And then the bottom is if a consumer were to participate in Clean Cars for All, scrap a vehicle, and then participate in CVRP. And the slides prior to this, and I can send you the presentation and we'll make sure that we have the link posted, has each of the individual programs broken out. So we'll leave this up for a few minutes. If you've got a question, go ahead and raise your hand and then we'll get to you in a few. Okay, Aria, back to you.
All right, next up we have Graham. Graham, I've unmuted your mic. Graham, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Got it. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Hello?
can.
Okay, great. Hi, this is Graham with Green Yachts. We help marine vessels convert to zero emission electric propulsion. And I just want to say I'm very grateful that California is the first place in the Western Hemisphere that is requiring some classes of marine vessels to be zero emission. I think that's great. There's one thing that Andrea said that I want to ask a question about related to this, which is she talked about the funding program, specifically Moyer, being funding emission reduction projects that are cleaner than the emission requirement. And to use the Moyer language, surplus emissions. With the commercial hovercraft regulations requiring zero emissions for short run ferries, there is no cleaner than zero. And so by passing this, groundbreaking requirements, it effectively eliminated the funding for all the short run ferries in California that have the difficult task of going first and converting to zero emission. So my question is, would CARB, and I know these guidelines will come out, but would CARB consider waiving the surplus or the emissions effectiveness criteria for any category of vessel where zero emissions is required, because there is nothing cleaner than zero? And the staff said in the March hearings about this, that these zero emission marine vessels can get funded up to 85%, which is the limit of the cost effectiveness limit. I wanted to see if for these zero emission vessels, if they could just have that 85% cost effectiveness limit and not the emissions limit, given that there is no surplus emission funding available for beyond zero.
Hi, this is Rhonda Rennan. I work in the Moyer program. And Graham, so as you know, Moyer, as you mentioned, Moyer is statutory required to have surplus reduction. So yes, we understand, and hear your concern, especially regarding this category with this new rule. We understand that it creates a lot of challenges for certain vessel types with the new amended regulations. So we can look at where we can be flexible and if there is any opportunity for funding ahead of the compliance deadlines. That's the one area we might be able to look at. But in general, yes, the way the current Moyer program is structured, emission reductions must be surplus to the regulation.
Yeah, as you understand, that does create a challenge as California advances its requirements. And the second question is, these projects are much bigger in scale. Instead of being $100,000 to $500,000, they're $1 million to $5 million. And the vessel operators can't really, and they're much longer. They're 2-year projects. And the vessel operators can't fund these projects while waiting for the project to be completed, prove operation, and then get the reimbursement through a Moyer or Volkswagen, whatever it is. If there was some sort of loan assistance program, like the truck loan assistance program in the funding program documents for the marine sector, because these short run ferries don't have the ability to fund these projects while they're waiting for whatever award they can get. So that's another suggestion to make it feasible for vessel operators to meet the regulations that have been enacted.
Yeah, thank you for your comment on the.
Thanks. I'll pass to the next speaker.
Thank you. Next up, I just a heads up, there's only 12 minutes left in our workshop tonight. And I know that we have to move on to next steps at 6:55. So just keep that in mind, everybody. Next up, we have Lonnie Mason. Lonnie, I've unmuted your mic.
Yes, just short and quick. Thank you for this. Can I have this emailed to me? And also, can you provide a list of the acronyms that are also in there too, as well?
Yes, absolutely. We'll follow up, Lonnie.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Next up is Ryan Huggins. Ryan, I've unmuted your mic. Right. Oh, there you go.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity and appreciate the information. Also, it'd be great to be able to get the slides. I work with a lot of forklift dealers and forklift fleets, and apologies if I missed this earlier in the presentation, but with the new zero emission forklift rules coming, there's a lot of concern for converting propane forklifts, and that hasn't historically been eligible for funding through CARB and CORE and things because those are diesel conversion programs. Is CARB looking to provide incentives for people that are trying to comply with that upcoming regulation before it goes into effect? Is that on the radar right now? Don't answer all at once.
I'm sorry, was that a Moyer question and I missed it? I apologize. Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure, yeah. So with the upcoming zero emission forklift regulation that requires converting propane to electric, that has been historically a gap in funding opportunities. And obviously the capital cost is still significant for small businesses. So I'm wondering if Moyer or any other programs would be eligible in the future for conversion of propane to electric forklifts instead of just diesel to electric.
Yeah, so propane, an LSI forklift to zero emission is currently eligible in Moyer. So that's a category that we encourage folks to go ahead and take advantage of, particularly if you're already in compliance with the LSI fleet rules as they exist today. And then we know that there's a zero emission forklift rule coming. And so ideally come in as early as you can prior to that rule, when I know that they're looking to, essentially require turnover to zero emission in certain LSI forklift classes. And the other thing is that, the proposed change that we're looking at, we're still working on whether, the kinds of increases or how it'll affect grant amounts by looking at the increase in the cost effectiveness for all zero emission and off-road. We're performing that analysis right now and in preparation for the board hearing. But in essence, we're hoping that we do whatever we can to encourage folks in all categories, especially the off-road space, to move to zero emissions. So hopefully that'll, like I said, this will be something that you can take advantage of as soon as possible.
That is great to hear, and that's different than what I've been told by various air districts administering the CARB Moyer. Rhonda, can I get your email just to be able to follow up if there's confusion in the future?
Sure. It's my first initial or first and last, rhonda.runyon@arb.ca.gov. Yeah. And I believe my contact will be listed on the last slide. So
thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I want to touch on the CORE. As you know, the CORE does offer some zero emission forklifts now in the larger sizes, 8,000 pound capacity and higher. So not all forklift sizes, but on the higher side. And a CORE does not require scrappage, but we don't say you don't have to scrap, right? You can scrap your old forklifts and bring in a zero emission CORE forklift. So right now CORE is open. If you want to check out the forklifts we have available now, they're at californiacore.org, and you can check those out right now.
Yeah, thanks. Those are great opportunities, but they typically aren't. The propanes tend to be a smaller capacity.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Next up, we have Stacy. Stacy, I've unmuted your mic.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Stacy Calles with Clean Air Grant Services. I might have missed this earlier in the presentation. I'm sorry, I was feeding children. But I'm curious, you mentioned that there are several or specific vessel types that are prioritized for funding in order to assist with the commercial hovercraft compliance. Where will there be certain percentages also reserved for other vessel categories like tug and tow vessels, workboats, crew and supply, pilot, etc.? And if yes, how will this be distributed? I've got a couple of follow-up questions to that, but I'll just stop there.
Hi, Stacy. I think I can answer some of your question there. There are 4 categories that are specifically called out in the legislation for us to prioritize, but that doesn't mean those are exclusively the only categories that will be funded with the commercial hovercraft funding in this year's budget. And after the board approves this funding plan in November, we'll begin the process for developing the program. And so we'll be holding work group meetings where we start to get into the details of how that program is going to work and what the eligibility requirements will be and all of those sorts of details.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think I'll hold my other questions and just contact you directly because it sounds like we haven't quite gotten there. So thank you so much, Jason. Appreciate it. Nice to see your face again.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stacy.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Victor Bees, I've unmuted your mic.
Hello, everyone. Victor Beas here with the Comité Cívico del Valle in Imperial County. Well, more than a comment is just, I just would like to, more than a question, I just would like to make a comment. I like the way you have been doing these sessions, these workshops. I've been following them, not only these ones, but any other, the zero emission vehicles and the incentive workshops. And I want to congratulate the CARB team because they've been doing an excellent job. And I've noticed with this, in this last meeting, I noticed that you considered a lot of the comments that we have made here in the past previous sessions. So thank you for that. And there's some details that I will, and most of the people have mentioned them. But yeah, most of it, I would like to just thank you all for this effort, and hopefully we can get a better incentive for the community and move this transition as fast as we can. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Victor. All right, so we're going to go over some summary and next steps before we depart. But again, I want to thank everyone for today's productive conversation. So as a refresher, here's the current schedule for funding plan development. We're going to continue to meet with stakeholders, including priority communities and community members, and refine our recommendations that will be included in the final funding plan. And again, I want to reiterate that our doors are always open and we're always happy to meet outside of our formal funding plan process and during our program implementation phases as well. And again, I know there was a lot of information in today's presentation. However, we want to provide a list of links to find out more about specific project or the funding plan development process. And lastly, here is our contact information. If you have any remaining questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, Graciela Garcia, or Lisa McCumber on the funding plan on clean transportation incentives, or Rhonda Runyon for the Carl Moyer program. If you'd like to continue to be involved in the public process surrounding the funding plan or Carl Moyer program, I encourage you to subscribe to our email list at the bottom of the slide. And again, thank you everyone for participating today.